All right, welcome everyone to the 2024 Backyard Farming Small Ruminant Series. My name is Megan Purdue. I'm the ag agent in Worcester County. Also on this call, we have Dr. John Moyle. He is our extension poultry specialist. And we also do have joining us Dr. Brittany Fletcher. She is our brand new ruminant specialist for University of Maryland Extension. She'll be joining us next week to be introduced to everyone, tell us a little bit more about herself. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about manure and mortality management, something that we all dread when we're raising animals of any kind, but a necessary thing to know what to do with it. Side effects of having animals, I guess. All right, and all of our programs are available to everyone. All right, so I always have a disclaimer in here. The advice in these presentations does not represent medical, veterinarian, or legal advice. Always seek a competent veterinarian advice when possible. Check your local regulations. That's another one especially for this one. If we use a website brand or product, it's not an endorsement. It's just what we have available. And then it is always essential to have a veterinarian in the event of an emergency. Especially when we're talking about mortalities, you want to have a vet on hand if possible that you can call. All right, so first we're going to talk about manure. You're definitely going to have to deal with manure. If you have animals for more than 5 seconds, you're probably going to have some manure, especially with sheep and goats. It is one of those side effects of owning animals. The amount that they produce is going to depend on the number of animals you have and their diet. So if they're eating really well, they're going to be pooping really well. But it's important too. We think of it as waste, and it can be a nuisance. But it's not truly a waste. That manure contains valuable nutrients and can be utilized as a very good fertilizer in some situations. The chart is one that we use in extension when we're trying to calculate about how much manure an animal would produce for nutrient management purposes. If you look down with the sheep and goats, they're in the 40, well, they're both around 40 pounds of manure per animal unit. So we talk about animal units, that is usually considered 1,000 pounds. So there are some rules in most states when it comes to manure. You need to know what regulations your state has on how manure can be used or disposed of. So in Maryland, we have nutrient management regulations, and you are required to have a nutrient management plan if your operation has 8,000 pounds or more of live animal weight, or it is grossing $2,500 or more per year. So that's gross. That's not that you're making $2,500 over your expenses. That's grossing. So if you sell a couple of really expensive goats at, $900 a piece, you sell 3 of those, you're already over that $2,500. It's very easy to do for people who raise horses, and especially if they sell a horse. Usually just selling one horse puts you over that limit. Any collected manure has to be managed in that nutrient management plan, and the NMP is what is called, it stands for nutrient management plan. So uncollected, we manage uncollected and collected manure in a nutrient management plan. So uncollected manure means that the animals are depositing it on pasture. Some of the problems that arise with that is there's going to be an uneven distribution of nutrients. Could be less of a problem with sheep and goats than cattle and horses, because they tend to have little pellets and they spread everywhere. Alpacas are going to have theirs in piles. So you're usually not going to get any distribution of manure with alpacas, because they're going to have their little toilets set up at various places, and they all go use the bathroom in those little areas, which is nice when it comes to controlling parasites, because they're staying away from where they're using the bathroom. The problem with manure piles is there's going to be more nutrients around them. So the grass may grow better around that manure pile. And sometimes in the middle of the summer, when a pasture's been overgrazed, you can look out and see where your manure piles are, because those are the dark green, taller tufts of grass. One, because there's more nutrients there where the manure's piled up, but also the animals may be avoiding it because there's manure there, not wanting to eat around it if they don't have to. Uncollected manure does not have to be managed in a Maryland nutrient management plan. Animals can spread manure wherever they want, regardless of what the phosphorus levels are in the soil. It's once you start picking it up that it has to be managed. So we call that collective manure, and that must be managed in a Maryland nutrient management plan. So if you take a pile of manure and throw it across the fence, technically you've collected it and you've distributed it. When we collect the manure, then we have to analyze it to determine the nutrient content. Usually collected manure is going to come from your barns and or around your feeding areas. So if you have a sacrifice area and the animals gather to eat, you're probably going to end up picking up some manure at some point, and having to spread that somewhere. Generally, you're going to stockpile this manure until it can be spread or exported. So you either utilize it yourself or you export it to another farm that can utilize it. So talking about exporting manure, usually there's going to be a lower demand for like small ruminant manure than other types of manure. It's less nutrient dense than the more popular commercial poultry manure in Maryland, or swine manure. There's also going to be less quantities available because it's more of a niche market. We don't tend to collect a lot of it in livestock operations. Your options are going to depend. If you want to export your manure, your options are going to depend on your location. Some people desire livestock manure because it doesn't smell as strong as like swine or poultry manure. It's less hot, quote hot. It's not as high in nutrients, so less likely to have some issues if they're putting it on a garden. For some importers, what the type of bedding is going to matter. So if you're looking at mushrooms, they usually want a certain type of bedding for mushrooms, versus some people who import it for composting want a certain type of bedding. So that is one thing to keep in mind. If you do plan on exporting it, make sure you know what type of bedding the importer wants. All right, when you spread your manure, that has to be included in farms that are managed with a nutrient management plan. You're going to spread March through November, and you only spread onto an active growing crop, such as a pasture. A pasture would qualify as an active growing crop. You don't want to spread it on bare ground that is not either going to have something planted in it very soon or is being left fallow. You want it into an active growing crop so those nutrients are utilized. You can spread it onto a field where grain crops will be planted. Usually that you would spread sometime in March for that. They'd plant in April or May. The pasture picture in the corner, that shows you some uneven distribution of nutrients. So I did an experiment with that, and I was experimenting on whether or not I truly needed some starter fertilizer on a newly planted fescue. And so I put the nitrogen out in strips and to see if I could see a difference. Yeah, I very much could see a difference. I think that was like a month in. It was quite obvious that the whole field needed some nitrogen. All right, when you spread manure, especially if you're going to spread it onto a fruit or vegetable crop, you need to make sure that you're following food safety standards. So a lot of people will use it on a garden, but you want to make sure that you were spreading it. Usually we spread it like a season ahead of time to make sure it's broken down if it's not been composted. And I did link an extension publication from Pennsylvania there that if you were interested in that, I would suggest reviewing that before you utilize manure on your garden. Generally speaking, you want to spread as closely to when the crop needs it as safely possible. I put safely in there because the exception of that is going to be garden crops, food crops that people eat. Normally when we talk about spreading manure, we're talking about grains and pastures, but if you are spreading on a crop that humans are going to consume, then we're going to spread it a lot further out than you would if it's like going to be a grain crop or a forage crop. Incorporation may have some benefits depending on the site characteristics and or the crop. Depends on how you're managing it. If you're spreading it into a pasture, an established pasture, you're not going to be able to incorporate it. But if you do incorporate it, it's going to trap more of that nitrogen and let the crops use it. But then if you're in a situation where you have a lot of slope, then there might be runoff issues. So it all depends on your site location. That's something to discuss. If you are under a nutrient management plan, that is something you can discuss with the planner, or you can discuss with soil conservation in your county. So generally with solid manures, we end up stockpiling them at some point. You shouldn't be spreading them over the winter, especially if you are under a nutrient management plan. You cannot spread it over the winter. So it has to be stockpiled until it is legal to spread. So you want to pick the appropriate site. Here's some guidelines from Maryland Department of Agriculture on how to stockpile. And this is meant generally for more commercial farms, but these are good recommendations for anyone stockpiling manure. We always prefer to have it covered. That way the rain's not getting it. There's going to be no runoff with it. And you can check with your county soil conservation districts for assistance. This may be covered. You may be able to get some cost share for it. We did have some changes to the cost share this year where small farms are able to get cost share funds to install best management practices like manure storage. So if you're in Maryland and that is something you are interested in, I would contact your county soil conservation to see what you need to do to be eligible. I do know that you need to get an exemption if you don't have enough animals to qualify for a nutrient management plan, or you're not grossing enough, then you need to get an exemption with one of the nutrient management specialists that work for MDA, and then you can get qualified for cost share funds. All right, some of the ugly parts of raising livestock is the mortality. So at some point, if you raise animals for long enough, you're going to have to deal with a dead animal. So if nothing else, old age is usually going to get them, and that's what we hope, more so than diseases or injuries. If you are raising them and you're kidding and lambing, at some point you may have a dystocia related problem where either the female doesn't make it, the lambs or the kids don't make it, or you have to put the animal down to prevent suffering. So usually you're going to end up with some mortalities that way. If you have larger predators or even a big dog problem, then you may end up losing some that way. Culling should be a part of all of our management. So you may decide to do that yourself, or you may decide to send them to the sale barn. If you do it yourself, then you'll have to deal with some carcass issues. And then if you are harvesting your own meat, so say you're out there, you're doing some on-farm butchering, that's going to leave you some waste too that you have to deal with. So some health and biosecurity considerations, if you're in a situation where you need to euthanize an animal, or you have a recently deceased animal, beforehand, before you dispose of it, you need to answer some questions and think about some things beforehand. So one is a necropsy needed. So have you had other mortalities that you don't have a good explanation for? That may mean that you need to get a necropsy to make sure that there's nothing going on your farm that could be prevented. Did the animal show signs of a reportable disease? If that's the case, then you need to have a necropsy done. Another important one is, did the animal bite anyone recently? We've been having it seems like a lot of animals testing positive for rabies in my area. And usually if an animal bites someone within the previous 10 days, even if you go to the vet's office and have a dog put down, one of the questions that they ask you is, has the animal bitten anyone within 10 days? If your animal has bitten anybody, you need to contact your vet, the county health department, or the Department of Ag before you do anything with that animal. Before you even euthanize the animal, you need to contact them ahead of time, because that's going to determine how you euthanize the animal. You do not want to do anything to the brain of an animal that needs to be tested for rabies, unless you want to have rabies vaccinations for yourself. And my understanding is the post-bite exposure rabies shots are not fun. I've had the preventative ones. I've not had the post-exposure ones. Those are the ones that really hurt. And then, has the animal shown any neurological symptoms? That could be linked to rabies as well. Some other considerations before you euthanize, is there any way that you can salvage the animal through slaughter? I mean, these are meat animals first. So and might be that it's a fairly young animal, could have been an injury, a recent injury that the prognosis is not good, and the best thing to do is to put it down. That animal might still be able to be salvaged through slaughter. So the whole animal doesn't go to waste. If you are going to do that, though, the animal needs to have not had any meds whatsoever, because it will be still within that withdrawal period. Some people harvest for the meat. Some people keep the hides on animals. And I have seen a lot recently people wanting to mount. Just depends on what type of animals you have and what you've been using them for. Is a C-section needed? So if it's a pregnant animal that's not able to deliver her babies, sometimes you can put the dam down really quickly and then do a C-section and deliver the kids or the lambs. And then one other consideration, I know we've talked about this in various presentations, but what's the copper status of your farm? This might be a good opportunity to get the liver and send it to the state lab for analysis and see what your copper status is, because that's the only way to really get a good information on what your copper status is to send the liver from a fairly healthy animal to the lab and have it analyzed. So those are some important things to think about before you put the animal down. So this came directly, I just copied this directly from a fact sheet, and I've linked the fact sheet in there too. It's from a fact sheet that talks about humane euthanasia of livestock, and it had a good definition for euthanasia. People think that euthanasia is a bad thing, but it shouldn't be a bad thing. So its definition is euthanasia is a Greek term meaning good death. And that's what our goal is when we put an animal down, is to have it have a good death and not to suffer. A lot of animals have to suffer because people don't want to put them down, either because they can't handle it or they think it makes them a bad person. But we are preventing further animal suffering by doing that, and that's the goal. So euthanasia, it's not wrong to end an animal suffering. I worked as an emergency vet tech for 7 years, and putting animals down did not bother me. Watching an animal unnecessarily suffer because an owner couldn't put it down, that is what bothered me more than putting an animal down. One thing to note is it's not always a perfect process, even if your vet is doing it. These are animals. Sometimes, they jerk at the wrong time. They might move at the wrong time. This is why if you go to have a dog euthanized, usually the vet's going to put, if you want to be present, the vet's going to put a IV catheter in it before they go to put it down. That means that helps that the process to go more smoother. That way, if they don't hit, if you don't have an IV catheter in there, they might not hit the vein in the right spot. They can blow a vein and it not go well. So we want to make sure that everything goes well. But again, it might not always be a perfect process, even if your vet is the one doing it. Animals have a mind of their own, and sometimes at the last minute, a very debilitated animal gets a burst of energy. You can ask about the animal's prognosis before treatment starts. Most vets are not going to mind that. Be upfront with your veterinarian. Your veterinarian should not be upset if you choose humane euthanasia over treatment. And I think people think that the vet's going to judge them. They're not. They don't want to see animals suffer either. Again, many people wait too long to make the decision to euthanize, either because they're attached to the animal or there is a fear of judgment. I get people calling me ever since I worked at a vet's office, so it's been over the past 15 to 20 years, asking me for permission to ask the vet to euthanize their animal. They just need somebody to say it's not a wrong decision. So this is a chart from another fact sheet. And again, I've linked that there so you can look it up yourself. There's a lot of good information on there. These are considered acceptable methods of euthanasia for sheep and goats. I did cut one off because I did not want to talk about that here. It was something that I have no experience with and I've never heard of before, so I didn't want to talk about it. You can read about it, but I didn't want to talk about that one. So a gunshot is considered a good animal welfare method of euthanasia. Something that you may, and probably everybody knows that. Another thing that you may not know or have experience with is a captive bolt gun. These are sometimes used on research farms. I know we used one when I was in college. That was the preferred method of euthanasia and the one that was acceptable for their standard operating procedures. And then one that most everybody is familiar with, if you've had any kind of pets, is barbiturate overdose. That would be what we used to call euthanasia solution. Or actually, we called it the pink juice because it was very pink. But that's the one that the vet would administer. That's not something you can do yourself, but it is considered an excellent, when it comes to animal welfare, method of euthanasia. But there are times when you have to euthanize. It's an emergency. The vet might not be available when you need them. And if you want to stop that animal suffering, you may have to euthanize it yourself. One caution is do not attempt it without the proper equipment and training. It's not something that a novice should be doing. Though again, many cautions. If you do not use them properly, firearms are extremely dangerous. And if you're familiar with the meme on the side, the picture on the side, he's talking about the long black train. It only runs in one direction. So if you make a mistake, something may die. And that's the goal of your euthanizing, but it could be something that you didn't intend to hit. One is ricochet. Bullets can ricochet and they can hit you. They can hit something that you were not trying to hit. So they might not hit the right location on the animal, or they might hit a building, a car, another animal, a person. So that is something to keep in mind before you try to euthanize something yourself. Consult the experts. So you want to make sure you have the correct tools for the job, the right firearm, the right ammunition. You want to get trained how to use it, and you want to practice before you actually have to use it. And then if you live somewhere that is not zoned agricultural, especially if you're near other neighbors, make sure that it is legal in your neighborhood to discharge a firearm before you attempt to. Otherwise, you may have the cops called on you. So this is a diagram. It shows the proper locations. If you did have to euthanize an animal, it shows you where the proper locations are. I think most of us grew up thinking that, you know, if you had to put down an animal, you shot it between the eyes. That is not the proper location in small ruminants. It's actually because their forehead is so thick, there's a larger chance of ricochet. So the recommended is like kind of behind the head, behind the horns, if they have horns. And this shows you a pretty good diagram of where you actually should be aiming for all of them. And again, that is another linked fact sheet in there. So once we've dealt with probably the hardest part of it, and I'll be honest, I went up until this past year without having to euthanize any of my animals myself. I have 3 brothers, and my dad, everybody always took care of it for me until this past summer when I had a goat. Of course, it was after office hours for the vet, and I think it was her day off too. And I had a goat with a broken leg with the bone sticking out. So I had nobody was available, so I had to do everything that I've read about and studied most of my adult career. I actually had to put it into practice this year, and it's not something I like doing. It's not something anybody likes doing, but ultimately it was between having the animal suffer versus me having to suck it up and take care of it. So once you deal with it, once you have a dead animal, then you have to dispose of it in some way. So probably the method that we're most familiar with is burial. You need to check into your specific county to make sure, and state to make sure that it is legal to do that, because there are laws that govern the burial of animals. If you are burying it, you don't want to bury near a well or other water source, not near creeks or rivers. Make sure you're not going to dig into a utility line or a pipe. I actually was putting up a T-post and found out where my electric line and water line were by accident. So it does happen, especially if you live on a farm and there's lines going from your house to your barn. So you want to make sure you know where those are before you start digging. It needs to be buried above the water table to prevent contaminating the groundwater, but you also have to bury it deep enough to prevent scavengers. Secondary poisoning is possible if the animal is euthanized with barbiturates. So if your vet euthanized it, you want to make sure that it is deep enough that a wild animal or a pet is not going to dig it up and get poisoned by what you used to euthanize the animal with. Cremation is another possibility. Again, this is just an example of what's available locally here through one of our funeral homes. They tend to do more pet animals, cats, dogs, stuff like that. But several people have had goats cremated through private cremation. So you'll have to check around to see what's available in your area. We do have a service that a lot of vets' offices use that does more like horses and large animals. But this is the preferred way to dispose of an animal that's been euthanized with barbiturates. So if the vet euthanized it, this would be the preferred method of taking care of it. Generally, these services offer private and or group cremation. That's going to depend on whether or not you go through the veterinarian. There might be different options available if it goes through your vet versus they pick it up on your farm. That some of these are specifically pet cremation services. Some of them might be a funeral home pet service. The big drawback to this one is it's very costly. So it may be cost prohibitive for you. Sometimes it is worth it to not have to dig a hole. Especially if you've done that before, you might say it's well worth the cost. So it just depends on the situation you're in. Rendering is another option. It might not be available in your area. It's not going to be an option if your animal was euthanized with barbiturates, because some of these, the product is going into dog foods and stuff that might be consumed by other animals. So they do not want anything with barbiturates in it to contaminate that. The transport can be costly. I think when I looked into it for a buck that had died, it was going to cost me $300, or I could drive it up there and it was like 4 hours away. So it's not something that's a good option for me in my area. So it may or may not be available to you. The other option would be composting, and you can compost both your manure and your mortalities. Composting is one of the most environmentally friendly ways to handle mortalities. Also your manure, it's a very good option for your manure. When done correctly, there's going to be few disadvantages. So it's a good source of nutrients for your garden. The final product is safer than manure for ground vegetables. The process involves heating, so it kills pathogenic bacteria. It can improve your soil texture. You're going to lose some nitrogen in it because nitrogen likes to leave very easily. And there's going to be, can take a long time, and there's going to be more labor involved in it. So one thing you need to think about is where to compost. So you don't want to do it next to your neighbor's kitchen window. We want to be good neighbors. You want it to be somewhere where you can easily access it and you're able to get water to it. We just had the first rain, I think, in about a month and a half. So if I was really if I had a mortality in my composter, I would have probably had to add some water to it to make sure that process continues to break it down, because this is the driest I've seen it that I can ever remember. You want to put it in a flat area. You want to put it away from water sources such as wells and ponds. This will attract flies to it, so that's something you need to keep in mind. And there also is the possibility that it could combust. So these are things to keep in mind when you're selecting your location. So what is composting? The United States Environmental Protection Agency defines it as composting is a controlled aerobic, so oxygen is required, process that converts organic materials into nutrient-rich soil amendment or mulch through natural decomposition. We say composting is both a science and an art. So there's some materials that you'll need to compost. So one material that you might have already that you just don't know is going to be your carbon source. So that's going to be something like old hay, straw, wood chips, leaves. So in your manure, you might already have, if you're cleaning out a shed, you might have straw or shavings already in there. If you're dealing with a mortality, you're going to have a lot more carbon source available. So next to my composter, I have a pile of old hay. That's where I put the old hay. And then if I have to put a mortality in that composter, then I have a nice bedding. I put in a nice thick layer of the old hay and put the mortality on it, and then I cover it up with a very thick layer of hay. The nitrogen source is going to be the animal or the manure. Oxygen is a requirement. Moisture, so if you had like a big dry spell like we did, you'd have to add the moisture in there. A big thermometer will help you measure the temperature to see if it's getting to the right temperature. You need a space for it, and then eventually you're going to have to turn it somehow. Mine has not been turned yet. I installed that composter. I made that last spring. It was a little over about a year and a half old. I've had a rough year when it comes to mortalities. Lost a couple of adults. I think 3 adult small ruminants and some mid-sized kids and a couple of like newborns in that amount of time. It's still not full yet. I can tell you that's just one single regular standard pallet height. It's about, I looked at it yesterday, it's about 2/3 full, even with all that in it. That'll tell you how quickly stuff does break down in it. So when you compost, you need your materials that are needed for composting. So your dead animal. I did not take a picture of any small ruminants in there because usually I'm attached to them. So you get to keep the picture of the chicken, the dead chicken in there. And she died of natural causes. Usually a fox gets my chicken. Um, so you need that dead animal or your manure, your bulking material. So wood chips, sawdust, um, the manure. So this is at the bottom picture is actually from commercial poultry. But any kind of manure, if it's coming out of a building, it probably has a mixture of bedding in it as well. Needs to get air to it and then about 50% moisture. So do you need a composter? No, you don't have to have a formal composter. You could certainly try to get cost share to build one, but you can construct one yourself. Um, Best case scenario, you have some sort of base to stop leaching and keep the area clean. So, like if you had a concrete base, that would be great. You want to be able to keep the pile contained. One is you don't want it to spread everywhere. Two, you want to make sure that pets and wild animals don't dig into it. So, like this one that I constructed was just 4 pallets, and I put some hardwire cloth on top of it. And use baling twine to secure everything down so it can be broken down. I can take one or all pallets down and to be able to get a piece of equipment in there to turn it if I need to. Um, that design has worked very well. So it's been over a year and a half now. The only time a wild animal has gotten in there, I think, was when the alpaca was in there, and it took a bit of effort to get an alpaca, a full grown alpaca, in there. And I think a fox was able to reach in and grab a leg, but that's the only time anything's actually gotten in there. The buzzards know when I've put something in there, like day 2 or 3, they know that it's in there, but they could not figure out how to get it in there. Even the black-headed buzzards, which are super aggressive, they stalked it for about a day and then they gave up on it. So they didn't even get close to it. They just kind of sat on the fence post outside of it. So I have been impressed with how well it has worked for something that cost me probably about $3 for the wire, and that just put the wire on there to keep anything from digging in there. So when you compost, it's like cooking. You just need the right ingredients. You mix them together and you let them cook. The process takes care of itself. You may have to turn it, but it will break down. When you're composting mortalities, make sure you have a nice layer of carbon, which could be a litter. For poultry, they usually will use the litter from the house. For livestock, it's probably going to be, stuff you've cleaned out of your buildings or old hay, straw, whatever you have available. Then you add one large animal, or you can layer it. So this is for poultry. The sign is for poultry. So that's a lot of like 6-pound birds, say. So like if you lost like 2 or 3 kids, you could put them in there in the same layer, but you don't want them to touch. And then you want to cover it with a good carbon source to prevent odors and help everything break down. Keep in mind when we're talking about animals that have been euthanized with barbiturates, especially if you're going to compost them, deceased animals are not metabolizing drugs anymore. So a live animal will eventually metabolize whatever drugs that you gave it, and it'll go out of their system. Once they're dead, they're not metabolizing anything anymore, so it kind of sits in their system. Barbiturates do pose an environmental risk. I started reading about this specifically because it's something that's always bothered me, especially knowing about soil and water quality and stuff like that. And I start thinking about how many of my brother's dogs has he buried here after they took them to the vet. And they were big dogs. And at an emergency vet, you use the same amount of barbiturate that you would use on a horse. So it's quite a bit. So if you are composting in animals that have been euthanized, you want to have a barrier that's going to prevent leaching from the compost pile. Absolutely make sure that wildlife and pets cannot access the pile. So this is not something I'd want to experiment with. I'd want a tried and true containment that you've already tried before with other mortalities before I used it on something that had been euthanized with barbiturates. I did look up the research on it, and there's not a lot of research on it, but the research I found, they are still showing the presence of barbiturates 6 months to 1 year in properly composted horse mortalities. And I say properly because they were doing everything by the book. On the farm, it doesn't always happen by the book. So they were doing everything they were supposed to, and they were still able to detect the presence of the barbiturate. It was considered a good way to dispose of the animal, but you want to make sure that you know what you're getting into, and then the way you handle the compost afterwards. So it might be a couple of years, but from what I read, really that barbiturate doesn't leave and really get decomposed until it's out in the soil. So that is not something I would want anywhere near my garden. So when you're dealing with your manure or your mortalities, you want to be a good neighbor. Don't put it next to their home. If you live close to someone else, don't set up your manure and mortality containment right next to your neighbor. Make sure that you take care of any mortalities quickly to prevent flies and odor. As we're getting into the colder months, but leaving the summer months, these animals can start to break down very quickly and start smelling pretty bad very quickly. And they also draw in scavengers as well. And then you want to make sure you're managing your litter, your manure to prevent flies and odor. So in conclusion, we think of them as waste and we think of it as a nuisance, something we don't like to deal with. But the reality is manure and mortalities are nutrient sources and they can be utilized if managed properly. Even that mortality, it's going to break down and there's going to be a lot of good nutrients in that mortality that could be used, but we just need to manage them properly. Make a plan and do your research. So, if you plan on having the vet out, if you plan on keeping animals until they're old and they're not useful anymore, odds are you're going to end up having the vet out to euthanize them at some point. So you need to have a plan for what you're going to do afterwards. If you are going to dispose of them on your farm, make sure you do your research and you do it in a safe manner that's not going to pose a risk to you, your family, the environment, wild animals. Have your resources before you need them. So like having a vet before you have an emergency, you need to be a good client to a vet before you call them up and ask them to euthanize your animal. That is not a good way to establish a relationship with a new vet. Contact the professionals for help. Your county soil conservation district can be an excellent source for you when it comes to best management practices for your farm. If you call the extension office, we can help you navigate what your options are. And actually the county itself would be a good source for information. But also I like to put this one in here. Don't be the reason for new regulations. So just because something is not against the law, if you do it and it sounds like a bad idea, then there might be a new law because of you. So you don't want to be the reason they have to put a new law in about managing your mortalities or managing manure. Right. And if you have any questions, like if you have direct questions, you can always email us. John is actually very good with manure and mortality management because he works with the commercial poultry. So I actually probably should have had him give this talk. But you can ask either of us any questions. I have done it for sheep and goats because I've raised them most of my life. It is something that you have to end up dealing with at some point. Like my brothers weren't around for forever to deal with it. I dealt with it on my own for probably the past 5 or 6 years. I got away with the family helping me for a lot of it before then. But you're welcome to email us with direct questions if you like.